So today's talk will be on game capture and translocation, as I said. And to our TUT students, you should know that you're not just studying textbooks, but you are the front lines of protecting our planet's most valuable ecosystems. You are the future game changers, and this is exactly what this workshop is about. We'll dive into real-world skills that separate good conservationists from great ones. So we want you to grow up and be those great ones, not just good ones. We would get deep into animal capture and translocation, learning on how safely and ethically you can move wildlife, not just as a task, but as a strategic tool for maintaining ecosystem balance. Think of this as more than just a job. It's a high-stakes puzzle where you're trying to balance science, strategy, and animal welfare. It's a kind of work that can define a career. With these few words, I would like to introduce the host of today. The host of today is my colleague, Kristen Neke, who is the Senior Coordinator for ShareSkin Africa. And with this, please welcome Dr. Kristen Neke. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Seller. Thank you, Dr. Seller. Brilliant. I'm very excited about today. And I would like to introduce our workshop for today. We've titled it Catch, Care, Conserve, Game Capture Up Close. And we have three absolutely brilliant speakers today. We have Dr. Guy Hausler, we have Dr. Max Krings, and Steve McCurry. Sorry, Steve, you need. I'm adding a doctor in, but you are amazing too. And we're going to first go on to Dr. Guy Hausler. His talk, we will be looking at what our key outcomes are from learning from this talk, but I'd just like to give you a little bit of an introduction to him. So, from nuts and bolts to hooves and horns, Dr. Guy Hausler traded engineering for the world of wildlife. He is currently the operations coordinator with SANParks Veterinary Wildlife Services in the Kruger National Park. From relocating wildlife and supporting research to something intriguingly named biobanking. Yes, Guy will explain this. His work lives at the wild intersection of science, strategy, and a fair bit of adrenaline. So before we start this, I would just like to go over the learning. So to understand the primary roles of the Veterinary Wildlife Services Department, to identify key considerations when capturing large mammals, to explain the purpose and functions of a biobank, to recognize when injured animals should receive veterinary assistance, and to describe how veterinary research supports the conservation of wildlife populations. And with that, I'd really like to welcome everybody to say hello to Guy and to welcome him onto our stage. Guy, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks for the intro. Morning, everyone. I'm Guy Hausler. I work for SANParks in the Veterinary Wildlife Services Department. And our department is responsible for all the veterinary management work and conservation work throughout the national parks of South Africa, which are run by SANParks. So we are not responsible for things like disease control, but we are responsible for assisting with any of the conservation work in any of those parks. So our department is really responsible for three main things. We're responsible for moving wildlife translocations. So if we have to catch any animals and move them between parks, for example, if we're going to reintroduce animals to new parks or to other conservation areas, we are the ones responsible for that. Sometimes we sell excess animals from the parks to generate income that we can use for other conservation work. And sometimes we donate wildlife to other conservation areas, sometimes in other countries in Africa. And quite often in recent times, we donate animals into what we call the wildlife economy, which is a way of the South African government supporting emerging wildlife farmers or ranchers who would like to work with wildlife. Often these are previously disadvantaged people, and they can put in applications for wildlife, excess wildlife that comes from our parks, and we will then capture animals and reintroduce them to land as part of this wildlife economy program. So that's a big part of our work. And then another big aspect is what I term conservation support, where we go out and assist the conservation management or the section rangers in the different parks with their day-to-day work. So that can be things like attending to injured animals, doing dehorning operations for rhinos as a tool to safeguard them, anything where a park manager or a section ranger needs to physically handle, especially your large mammals. We are the ones who are responsible for doing that. And then we also facilitate a lot of wildlife research projects across the various parks that are managed by SANParks. You can imagine if you're a researcher, you cannot come to the park by yourself and go and catch elephants or go and catch a rhino or lions or whatever it is. So we facilitate those projects, and any researchers who want to work on these big mammals, we will work with them in the field, and we will basically capture animals and present them with immobilized animals or sleeping animals, and assist with collection of samples and collection of data and all of that. And then in parallel with this, we run what we call a biobank. And a biobank is a very specialized facility. It's basically a store of biological samples that we collect from all the animals that we work with. And we'll talk a bit more about that later in the presentation. But it's a major aspect of our work and a very important aspect of our work, but it's quite hidden because people see us out in the velds catching animals and moving animals, and they don't often know that kind of in the background, hidden away at our laboratories, we have this biobank, and we're collecting samples for research that are then held in the biobank. All right, but as I say, we'll talk a bit more about that later. We are not responsible for disease control in wildlife in the parks. That's the state veterinary services are tasked with that. But in a park like Kruger, we've got our own capture team and veterinary unit working in the park, and the state vets also work in the park. They've got their own offices and their own setup, but there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination between the two because the state veterinary services often want to sample animals that we're working with, et cetera, et cetera. So we work together actually on a daily basis, basically. So if we're going to go and catch an animal, and it doesn't matter if that's in Kruger or any of the other parks, before we go out and capture this animal, we need to give some thought as to what species we're catching and why we're catching that animal. Are we catching this animal to treat it? Are we catching this animal because we're going to move it somewhere else? Are we going to be doing a research project? How long do we want this animal asleep or immobilized? And so we have to consider all of these things, what the weather conditions are like. Are the conditions favorable that we can fly using a helicopter and dart the animal? All of these things factor in. But we basically base what we're doing and our approach, depending on the species. We will decide on what drugs we're going to use, and we will decide on how we're actually going to go about the capture operation. All right. So today, just to give you an overview, we will start with looking at your large herbivores and how we capture them. So things like rhinos, elephants, buffalo, we work with quite regularly. And when we do this, we typically use the helicopter, and we go out and locate the suitable animals in the veld. And then the vet working from the helicopter will then dart the animals. And once these animals are showing signs or becoming affected, then we can approach them and we can then work with them. All right. So in the case of the rhinos, and we work with rhinos very frequently because of the threats to the animals that we have in the park, we would immobilize them. And then if we want to load them, we can actually walk them like this, and we can walk them straight into a crate. You can see the crate in the background there. And we can then load the animals on a truck and move them. All right. If we work with species like buffalo, They are not easy to walk, and obviously it's a very dangerous species, and even more so for things like elephants. If we had to catch and load an elephant, it's not a species that we can immobilize and then get up and walk into a truck. So for an elephant, for example, we would have to have the animal completely asleep. And then the method we use in SANParks is, especially for the big animals, which are challenging to work with, we lift them like this with a crane, and then we lay them down. You can see they lay on that big mat, big piece of conveyor belting underneath the elephant. And then we winch the elephant up onto a trailer like this. And then we use that trailer to bring the elephant out from the veld. And from there, we can cross-load it into a big recovery unit like this. So we are basically going to slide the elephant into that trailer, close the doors, and then we can reverse the elephant so we can give it a drug to wake it up. And then you can see in the background there's a transport truck. So we can then walk the elephant through into that transport truck and go and catch the next one. All right. And so for these dangerous species, that's what we would do. And mostly we're talking about moving your large herbivores. If we do buffalo, we also work with them while they're asleep. And we then load them onto individual stretchers, lift them with a crane, and put them into a truck like that. And then we can translocate them. All right. If we work with plains game, things like zebra, your antelope species, those animals we can, if we want to, we can mass capture them. And so in that case, we don't actually individually immobilize or dart the animals. Instead, we build a capture boma, like you can see in this photograph. And you'll see the boma is basically like a large funnel that we build in the veld. The sides of the boma are made of plastic sheeting, which has been suspended from a steel cable or between two steel cables. And you can see at the top there's some green colored sections, which are like curtains. You can draw those curtains open, and then you can come with a helicopter and chase a group of animals in from the top. Maybe it's a group of zebra. And as they move down through the funnel towards where the trucks are, you've got multiple curtains, and you can close them in first at a top curtain, and then you've got 3 or 4 curtains as you move down through this capture boma. Eventually, you're going to have the animals caught in the narrow section of the boma, and then you can sort out what you've captured and load them straight up a ramp and onto the truck. All right. So here we see it in action. You can see the capture team hiding in the curtains, which have been drawn back, the animals running in, and they will then close them in, and you will eventually have them in this narrow crush, and then you can load them straight up a ramp and onto the truck. All right. So this is a method we use for any kind of antelope species, zebra and stuff like that. It's used a lot in the southern parks. So the smaller parks that SANParks manages down in the south and the west of the country, because we quite actively manage the game populations in some of those parks. It's not something we do very regularly in Kruger because Kruger is so big. And also we have foot and mouth disease in Kruger. And so it's difficult for us, if not impossible for us, to get permits to move animals from Kruger, any cloven-hoofed animals, to move them out of the park to other conservation areas within South Africa. Okay, so that's how we typically capture your large herbivores. And this applies across any of the parks, 19 parks that SANParks are currently managing. Okay. So another major aspect, perhaps the biggest aspect of our work currently, is this conservation support work. And this is when we're going to handle things like orphaned rhinos, where the mothers were poached, do the rhino dehorning, where we're removing the horns from the rhinos for safety's sake, and then assisting animals which are snared or injured, and then dealing with damage-causing animals. Okay, so just to jump to the snared and injured animals, the guiding principle by which we work is that we will only intervene if an animal was snared or injured by humans. So if an animal's been snared or shot and wounded by a poacher or gets hit by a vehicle or something like that, we will intervene. if an animal is injured under natural circumstances, like two animals were in a fight and one is injured, then we are completely hands off. That's a natural process, and so we don't get involved in those kind of cases. But anything that was caused by people, we can intervene and do something. All right. So for the rhino orphans, since the poaching really got bad, especially in Kruger over the last 10 or 12 years, we got quite a few of these orphans. And if they are 3 years or younger, they're quite vulnerable if they're left out in the veldt. And obviously, they're very small, they're still suckling, and they need milk from their mothers. So if we have these orphans, we go and follow up as quickly as possible. We immobilize the animal. Here we have these two youngsters. You can see these are animals that are under a year old. And so we immobilize them and we do a health check, and then we actually bring them into captivity. And then we raise them in captivity as orphans until they're about 5 years old, 6 years old, and then we can release them back into the wild. All right. And we've had very good success with this. You can imagine these animals are often in very remote areas where we go and recover them. So we then actually fly them back to a BOMA facility where we can raise them. And so if the animals are a few hundred kilograms, maybe up to 300 kilograms, we can pop them inside the helicopter, like you see on the right-hand side photo there. If they are a little bit bigger, up to about 700 kilograms, we rather sling them with the helicopter. So while they're immobilized, we attach slings to their feet, and then we lift them and we fly them either to Skukuza or any other location where we've got BOMAs that we can raise those animals in captivity. All right. And when we raise them, we put them with surrogate mothers. So young female white rhinos that we use as surrogates just to kind of, provide a motherly influence for them. And they do very well in captivity. And we've had very good success with raising these orphans over the last 12 or 15 years or so. For the dehorning, it's also a very important aspect of our work. We started rolling this out in 2020 in Kruger National Park, and it's now spread to some of the other parks as well. And it's one of those tools that we use to try and counter the poaching pressure that we're under. And it has had a very big impact, and it has helped a lot. It's not the perfect solution. It's not the silver bullet that's going to solve the poaching, but by removing the horns and trimming them down and doing that continuously, we go back on about an 18-month cycle and retrim the horns. Then it allows us to keep the temptation and the reward for the poachers, keep that to a minimum. So this is something we do on an annual basis. We block book periods during the year, and we just go out dehorning every day and try and keep all the animals in the population as safe as possible. For the snared animals and the injured animals, we'll get reports from the rangers or from park visitors where animals have been caught in a snare, and especially your stronger animals like your predators and your large herbivores, they may get caught in a wire or a cable snare, then they break free and they'll be walking around with the snare. And then we go and follow up as quickly as we can and try and remove these snares. You can see here's a case in a hyena. And then here we have a cable snare in a young elephant. And logistically for us to find these animals and track them down and get the snares off can be a very long process. You can imagine one animal bumbling around in a park the size of Kruger can be very difficult to relocate that one individual and actually get to treating it. But if we manage to find it, it's quick. We remove the snare, we give the animal some painkillers and some antibiotics, and then we let them go. So we don't suture up wounds or anything like that. We just let the animals go. And they typically recover very well from these snare injuries. And we similarly handle animals which are injured by poachers. If animals get shot and wounded, then we follow up on them and treat them. We normally treat them in the wild, and then we go and follow up repeatedly and go and retreat them as necessary. Okay. All right. And then we quite often are called to handle damage-causing animals or problem animals. And so this is often things like primates, hyenas, honey badgers, which get into the staff living areas in the parks or get into the tourist rest camps in the parks. And the best for us is then to go and catch these animals. Things like hyenas and honey badgers, we will go and cage trap them like you see here, and then we will remove them from the rest camp or from the staff living areas. Obviously, we sometimes catch random animals by accident, things like civets and genets and species like that. And those animals we can just release back into the rest camp. Those animals are of no real risk and they won't really cause damage. If we have an animal that's immediately of danger to staff or to park visitors, things like a lion or an elephant that gets into the rest camp, then we respond immediately and we go and try and dart and immobilize those animals and remove them. Or in the case of an elephant, we can often just chase them out of the rest camp again. But things like honey badgers and hyenas, it's easier for us to just go and cage trap them and then remove them from the camp. We then sometimes get called to assist with other situations where animals are in distress. Here we have some buffalo that got caught in the mud in this waterhole. And this may be seen as a natural event, but this waterhole is an artificial waterhole. And you can see in the background there, it's one of the rest camps at Punda Maria. And so we went to assist in getting these animals that were stuck in the mud, just removing them from the mud. And subsequently now this waterhole is being rebuilt so that hopefully these animals will not get stuck in the mud like this in the future. Here we can see the boundary of the park, and I'll just highlight this little section down here along the fence where you can see these two male lions. And these lions had actually escaped the park. And this can happen sometimes. Sometimes the fence is damaged when there's flooding, or community members living on the outside of the park actively damage the fence and steal fence material. And so we do get species, especially lions, elephants, and sometimes buffalo that escape the park. And the law in South Africa is that animals that escape the park become the responsibility of the Provincial Nature Conservation Authority. So around Kruger, it would be LADET or MTPA. But we will often go and assist them in recovering the animals and bringing them back into Kruger. So we always have a team on standby. If animals escape the park, then we are able to go and assist and get those animals back into the park and make sure the people on the outside stay safe and the animals are safe. So that's one of those things which quite often crops up that we have to handle. All right, and then to talk about some of the veterinary research and to talk more about the biobank that we run. The research can be very varied. People might come to us almost on an annual basis with new ideas for projects that they want to run. And anything to do with the larger mammals in Kruger, we will be facilitating those projects. You can imagine if somebody's coming to the park to work on vegetation or to work on birds or insects or something small, they can typically go and do field work themselves. They get a game guard, and then they can go out into the field and collect data. But if we're going to be sampling buffalo or elephants or lions, something like that, then we will facilitate those projects. Okay. So currently we've been very busy the last 3 years with a lot of buffalo research. This is actually driven by disease research. One project looking at foot and mouth disease and one project looking at the bovine TB in the buffalo. And this is quite typical. What you'll see when we're working with buffalo, we will immobilize a couple of animals at a time, up to about 10 animals. And then our team, you can see our team are the ones in the olive green uniform. They will be there assisting the researchers and the state veterinary staff, who will then be collecting samples for the disease research from the animals that we've immobilized. All right. This is typically done in the field. So we just immobilize the animals and sample them, and then we release them. Sometimes there's repeat sampling. So a subset of these animals for these projects are often fitted with tracking devices. This is what it looks like. And then we will go on a 6-month cycle or a 1-year cycle and go and recapture these same individuals and sample them again to see how a certain disease, like a foot and mouth infection or a bovine tuberculosis infection, how the disease is progressing. Sometimes we put tracking collars onto the animals, but more and more we're going over to using these GPS satellite ear tags, like you can see in this picture. And we've applied this now across many species: giraffe, all your antelope species, all sorts of predators, etc. So it helps us, and it's an easy and cheaper way for us to track wildlife, and to go and resample animals if we want to. Okay, so there is a lot of disease work that also happens with predators, especially your lions and hyenas. And so we quite often go and catch these larger group living predators. With the predators, we're going to work at night because that's when they're more active and more responsive. And to do this, we're going to put out some kind of bait, so a dead impala or a dead zebra or something like that, to act as bait to get the animals to come to a feeding site that we can then immobilize them. And we will then set up a little processing station, something like this. And as we immobilize animals at the bait site, we will then put them onto stretchers, load them onto a vehicle, and move them a short distance away to the processing site, work on them at the processing site, and then return them to the bait site and wake them up and let them go. The reason for us doing this is if we're working with these species and we're working at night, it can be quite risky for the research team. We're going to have a lot of predators, sometimes other things like elephants and buffalo hanging around. So we rather have the people work safely at a slightly remote site, a processing site, and we just go and catch the animals and bring them back for processing, and then we release them again. All right. The exception perhaps for this is if we work with wild dogs, and because of the conservation concern about the species, we do work with them quite often. These guys we're going to work during the day. And often a warmer day can be an easier opportunity for us to go and catch them, because on a warm day, these guys will feel quite lazy, especially late in the day, in the afternoon. They'll be napping somewhere in the shade, and then we should have an easy opportunity to go and dart the dogs that we want to work with and then work with them. So yeah, it's typically during the day that we're going to capture these guys and work with them. So that covers a bit of the disease research that we're busy with. We also do a lot of anesthetic research and physiology research on your larger mammalian species. Here you can see the team is busy with an immobilized elephant, and this is a physiology project. We're looking at blood pressure values, blood gas values for the elephant while it's immobilized. So if we immobilize the animal with a certain drug combination, how is that affecting its blood pressure and all its other vital signs, and how's that affecting its blood gas values? And you can see that big bag in front of the elephant. We're actually collecting the air that the animal's breathing in and out and analyzing the air to see how well this animal is doing at getting oxygen into its blood. And we've done this across many species and in many different forms. Here we have a similar thing. This is a rhino, which we're keeping in the bomas. And you can see all the fancy monitoring equipment that we've hooked up to the animal while it's immobilized. And here we are testing the same stuff and using different drug combinations over the course of the study to see the effects of the different drug combinations, and hopefully learn by doing this which drug combinations are best for immobilizing the animals in different situations. So if it's in the wild, if it's in the bomas, if it's young animals, old animals, how long we need the animals immobilized, all of those kind of aspects. All right. So this is the kind of in situ research work that we are involved with. But it can be very varied. This is just a snapshot of the most recent stuff. But as I say, it changes basically year on year, depending on what research requests come our way. And then lastly, the biobank. So we run laboratories in Skukuza and then in Kimberley as well, where our other team is based. And these laboratories function in support of the research and any external researchers who want to work with us on research projects. And the samples that we bank as a standard look like this. You've got blood samples, and then tissue samples and hair samples for genetic work. That's what you see on the right-hand side, and a fecal sample there in the background. All right. And these samples are taken from every animal that we work with. We then process them in the laboratory, and we put them into the cryotubes that you see on the left there. And then they go into a specialized freezer, an ultra-low freezer, so they are at minus 80 degrees Celsius in the freezer. And at that temperature, they're never going to go off or go fraught or anything like that. And so we can then use those samples for future research. Whether we use them tomorrow or we use them in 10 years' time, they will be there available for researchers who want to work on projects on genetics or projects on using any of the blood samples that we have available. Currently, we have about 150,000 sample sets in the Skukuza Biobank. And as far as I'm aware, we are the biggest biobank in the world for free-ranging African wildlife. So it's a very important aspect of our work, but as I said, it's not something that people necessarily know about, but it is a very important part of the work that we do. There's also a huge financial benefit in us running a biobank like this, in that the cost of going to go and catch an animal just to sample it and get a blood sample or get a genetic sample is prohibitive sometimes. It's very expensive to go and fly with a helicopter. The drugs are expensive. And so to go and sample animals actively to get a blood sample or a genetic sample can be really out of reach for many research projects. But if we have those samples banked, we can, any request that comes our way, if we authorize those requests, then we can facilitate research using the samples that we have available in the biobank. And a lot of very species of conservation concern, like elephants and rhinos and predators, are very well represented in our biobank because we work with them often. Species like impala, which are very common, are fairly infrequently sampled by us because we don't need to work with them. So they are actually very underrepresented in our biobank. All right, so that I hope gives you a quick overview of the work that we do in Veterinary Wildlife Services and across the parks of South Africa.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was really, really fascinating. I found it absolutely an amazing wonderful visual journey for all of us into game handling and care. And I just wanted to say to our students that are in the audience that I think Guy has offered you an amazing invitation. If you do decide to do research on any game species in the Kruger National Park, he is offering you access to this incredible biobank, which I think is an amazing opportunity. Thanks, Guy. And we have some lovely, lovely questions for you from the audience. I am going to start with, first of all, if anybody wants to ask their question in person, you're welcome to raise your virtual hand and Moret will unmute you. But in the meantime, I'll ask you a question from the chat, Guy. We have Eston Kimaswatch, and he asks, what is the empirical evidence supporting dehorning of rhinos as a deterrent to poaching? Secondly, is there research that has been done on behavioral and physiological impacts to the rhino before and after dehorning?
Look, it's difficult for me to say exactly to put numbers to the impact on how dehorning has reduced poaching, because it's a tool that we've introduced, but we've also introduced a number of other tools which have assisted in decreasing the poaching numbers. So it's difficult to single out the dehorning as being the one factor which has helped reduce poaching. But poaching has been going down over time. After we started with dehorning, a lot of poaching pressure shifted to other areas and other parks where dehorning had not been implemented. So that's the only real feedback that we've got that it is something that's working. But I also don't think it's sustainable that we're going to be dehorning animals every year for the next 30 years. I don't think it's a really long-term solution. It's just a stopgap while we try and get control of other aspects. And look, we haven't done any work, particularly in Kruger, on behavioral changes and issues like that. The animals can still defend themselves, and they don't necessarily need their horns for survival, especially as an adult. We still see animals managing to have big territorial fights and sometimes severely injure each other or even kill each other without having their horns. When the animals in the population all had their horns still, we would quite often get bulls that would fight, and because they had sharp horns, they would end up, one of them or both, with penetrating wounds into their abdomen. And we don't seem to see that very often now, which is possibly because they've been dehorned, and it's difficult for them to make those kind of injuries. But no direct study has been done on a change in behavior. I don't think there will be a huge shift in behavior, because they don't necessarily need their horns for much day-to-day activity.
Thanks, guys. Super.
Okay.
Right. Another question from Bianca Janse van Vuren. How do you control the elephant population in Kruger? Okay, this is a big one. If it is through contraception, which one do you use? PZP, she asks, and how effective is the program?
Look, currently there's no elephant population control in place in Kruger. It's a very hotly debated topic, and it's really handled by our conservation management. We don't do any control measures really currently, and so there's nothing on the go. It is a big issue, and it's a real potential concern for the park, perhaps in the long run. But there's no there's no contraception or anything on the go currently in Kruger. Unfortunately, the elephant population is so big that we can't actually roll it out in Kruger, even if we wanted to. We don't have the resources to get to contracepting enough animals that we could have an impact.
Thanks, Guy. A question from Joyce Loza. What is the plan with the horns that have been cut? Do you generate income from them to invest in rhino conservation efforts?
Look, at the moment, we don't trade with the horn. We don't destroy the horn, but we don't trade with it. There's not really a market for it in South Africa. In the long run, if we could, and this is obviously a much bigger question, something would have to be handled probably by the Department of Environmental Affairs. But if we could trade with the horn, potentially we could make a lot of money that we could channel back into conservation, and we could channel that money not just towards protecting rhinos, but towards protecting, vultures and pangolins and all the other species, wild dogs, all the other species which are at risk of conservation concern currently. But at the moment, we don't destroy the horn. We just store the horns that we remove, and then perhaps one day we will really be able to trade with them. But currently, we don't at all.
Okay. Thanks, Guy.
Okay.
A question from Sasha Bornman. Guy, are the GPS ear tags live tracking via apps or VHS only? We are looking for more affordable ways of keeping track of animals, especially predators, on site.
We have some we have multiple different systems on the go, and different research teams have come with different systems. But the ones that, for example, are deployed in the buffalo, you can track them through an app, and it's through GPS systems. So that would fit the bill. But I must also say that especially species like buffalo and rhinos that we fit with those ear tags, they can be very hard on the ear tags sometimes, and they bash them up compared to species like kudu, let's say, or impala. And the other issue is some of these solar powered devices, especially in species that like to wallow, like buffalo and rhinos. They'll go and wallow, and then they cover up the ear tag or the little solar panel with mud, and then it goes offline. And after a while, then the mud cakes and breaks off, or they rub it off, and then it powers up again. But you can have these blank spots where you're not getting any data. And also because they're big, bulky animals and they tend to rub on stuff, they sometimes bash up the ear tags. So some of them last 3 months and some of them last a year. It's very difficult to predict.
I've got a question from Christoph, who says, thank you, Guy, for the presentation. He has a question on active surveillance in buffaloes. What is your experience regarding the monitoring of sampled animals with tracking devices, as these are prey animals, especially in high density lion populations? Would you recommend active surveillance considering the logistic aspects?
If we're talking active surveillance, like following up by people, it can be done, but these projects, sometimes have 300 animals or 200 animals with tracking devices on them. we've generally suggested that people deploy devices that will give a mortality alert, for example, that we can then go and recover the devices. Some of the animals are actually implanted with things like internal temperature loggers and that kind of stuff. So for some of the projects, it's quite important if an animal is predated or it dies, that we get there to the scene so we can recover those loggers, because otherwise the hyenas chew them up or swallow them or run around with them, and then we don't recover that data, which is important for a project. But yeah, that's really just using the collars or the ear tags and their mortality signals. We don't really have the resources to do more than that in the way of following up on the animals.
Okay, makes sense. Guy, or our audience, we have time for one, maximum 2 more questions, and then we're going to move on to the next speaker. We have quite a packed afternoon. Anybody that has got questions that haven't been answered, the speakers have offered to answer them following the workshop, so we can just pass those questions on to the speakers for you. So one other question from Kingston. Won't trading the rhino susceptibilize, I'm not sure about that word, the rhinos to poaching, having opened up the market for the rhino horn?
Look, that is a big concern, and I think that's why it hasn't been done up till now. As I say, this is something at a national, at a government level that has to be discussed and decided. But certainly, the way it is now, if a person is trying to transport a horn somewhere, especially if they're trying to take it out of the country, it's illegal. Local trade within South Africa is allowed to a certain degree, but export is not allowed. So any horn that's leaving the country indicates somebody's up to mischief, and somebody should be apprehended or prosecuted for doing that. And that is a risk. If we could trade the horn, the market would be overseas. And even if you have a good permitting system in place, you know how things are in South Africa, there may be corruption in that process, and it'll be quite a gray area because horns will be leaving legally, and you might have issues that, horns from poached animals or horns which are illegally leaving will make it out as well. So I think that's why a lot of people are nervous to actually open up the trade, is because at the moment there's a blanket ban, and so we've got hopefully strict control. And if somebody's moving a horn out illegally, it's illegal. But if there was trade and if we were moving horns legally, then there's a lot of gray area for people also doing illegal stuff, whether that be getting fake permits or bribing permit officials or just moving the horns and claiming that these were legal movements. So that is an issue. And I think that's part of the reason that the department have not actually made any progress with opening up trade to the countries which would actually, where the demand is.
Okay. Guy, one last question.
Cool.
This is actually from one of my colleagues, Letu, and she asks, oh no, it's not. She's just sending it on to me, sorry. It's from Anahi, have you tested the ear satellite tag in cheetahs? Are their ears big enough, and would the cartilage resist the weight?
We typically, for predators like that, things like cheetahs, even for lions and hyenas, we fit the same devices, but we actually rivet them onto a small, quite a lightweight collar that we put onto the animals. So it's the same technology, but we are concerned about putting these tags into the ears of predators, and especially cats. So we rather put on a collar. It's not as bulky as your traditional, tracking devices, which have quite a weight at the base, etc., etc. It's very lightweight, but we use a piece of webbing material for the collar, and then just actually rivet the device, or have a special holder that we can secure the device onto a collar. It's much nicer for basically for any of your larger cats or for things like hyenas.
Thank you, Guy. Okay, just a little thing now. If anybody has more questions for Guy, you can just type it into the chat, and during the time that we have left in the afternoon, he will answer those questions, if that's okay, Guy.
For sure.
Perfect.